Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's meeting concerning the Camp Grayling PFAS. Before we get into our first series of presentations, I would like to do a little housekeeping with you this evening. First, just want to let you know that all of your microphones are muted for the webinar, but I will let you know how you can talk with us this evening. And also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded for later viewing, so you can share it with friends and colleagues who were not able to join this evening. Now, in terms of speaking with our panelists tonight, there are a few ways to do that. First, you may use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom control panel. Just feel free to type a question in at any time during tonight's conversation. Also, when we get to the question and answer portion of tonight's conversation, you may choose to raise your hand and to electronically raise your hand so that we'll see you. We will unmute your microphone so you could talk to tonight's panel of panel presenters. And for our attendees who are listening by phone only, we do have two in attendance that are listening by phone only. For those of you on the phone, you can select the pound and the number 2 button. Again, it's pound number 2 to electronically raise your hand for those on the phone, and we will see you and unmute your line at that time during the question and answer portion. We will go over the housekeeping again when we get to the Q&A later in the conversation. But for now, I'll hand this virtual microphone over to Abigail Hendershot. Abby is the MPART Executive Director. Abby, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Les. Appreciate being here tonight. Appreciate all of you guys coming and joining us for this Camp Grayling PFAS Town Hall. I think this is a very important way to get information to the community about these important investigations that are being done. And as Les said, I am Abigail Hendershot. I am the MPART Executive Director for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. And if we can go to the next slide. I'm going to do some introductions. We're going to go through just a brief overview of what the agenda looks like, cover some MPART slides, and then we'll get into the actual meat of the presentation. You're going to have plenty of time at the end to ask questions. You can type questions as we go along so we can answer them in the order that you think of them, so you don't have to write them down. And you can put those in the question and answer box so we can get to them. But for tonight, we're going to do a quick overview of the MPART itself, what it is, what it means. And then we're going to have an overview of PFAS, of the potential health issues. Sasha Calicuri is our Department of Health and Human Services toxicologist. She's going to talk to you about that. And then Army National Guard, Bonnie Packer is also going to give you some PFAS overview. For the Camp Grayling timeline, Department of Military Veterans Affairs, Jonathan Edgerly is going to talk with you. And then for some of the site-specific investigations, we've got Eagles, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Christian Bond, our project manager, who's been leading that charge, as well as Sasha and Bonnie, again, giving some additional updates. So quite a bit of information here tonight, but I think it's going to be well worth your time. As Les says, it is going to be recorded, and we usually go ahead and send out those slides afterwards too, so you don't have to take a ton of notes. Don't try to take screenshots. Don't try to take phone pictures. We'll get you the slide deck so you've got it all, so you just sit back and listen tonight. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is MPART? MPART is as I said, Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. It was started as part of an executive order in actually 2017 and re-upped with Governor Whitmer in 2019. It's a very unique multi-agency approach. So we have 7 different departments within the state of Michigan that are all part of this PFAS Action Response Team. And it really helps us to be able to lead that coordination for PFAS and get cooperation among all of the different agencies, because PFAS really crosses so many different agencies and so many different programs that it has to be coordinated, and the implementation of the state's strategy has to be coordinated, because it's not like one department or agency can do actions for PFAS without affecting somebody else. So next slide. Couple of things to keep in mind for tonight. It's very important to understand that in August of 2020, The state passed what they call MCLs, maximum contaminant levels. Those were drinking water criteria that went into effect for municipal systems, but they also, through the some of our other state programs, also become drinking water cleanup criteria for PFOS, PFOA, PFNA, PFHXS, HFPO-DA, which is also the same thing as Gen X, PFBS, and PFHXA. So they all have criteria that are effective right now. And you'll see that most of the time, PFOA or PFOS end up being the driver for these cleanups. But when we talk about cleanup criteria, these are the ones we're really talking about. Although when we do investigations, you'll see that we do sometimes talk about total PFAS, because we do analyze for more than just these 7, but these are the ones that actually have enforceable criteria. Next slide. So one of the other things that's unique about MPART, and there's a lot of other stuff out there about MPART that's very unique, but we're going to talk about, we'll go to the website here in a little while. But one of the other things is the Citizens Advisory Work Group. So we've taken and gotten input from residents from across the state, such as yours, that have had, excuse me, been impacted by PFAS. And so we've gotten 2 representatives from each community to actually give us feedback, give us recommendations on how we can better engage and empower communities. How do we educate the public to make sure that they know what's going on in their community, or the potential risks for PFAS, because the science is evolving, the situation is evolving, and Michigan is really leading the country in a lot of these efforts. And we're very proud of that, but we're also cognizant of the fact that this is not just a state issue, this is a national issue, and we want to collaborate with all of our partners on all different levels. So that includes the citizens. So I think we were looking for potential volunteers who might want to join us from the Grayling area. So next slide. So we will go to the MPART site at the very end of the presentation, but this is the official website. You can just type in MPART into Google, it'll come right up, or you can type in michigan.gov/PFAS response. And these are the different 7 agencies who are part of MPART. And so I will leave it at that for now, because we've got a number of things we'll walk through with the website when we get to the very end of the presentation. So now I will pass it off to Sasha Kalikuri. So thank you. Sasha?
Thanks, Abby. Hello and good evening. I'm Sasha Kalikuri, toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And I want to thank you all for attending this meeting virtually. So now I'm going to talk about the ways people could come in contact with PFAS and what we know about the health effects associated with PFAS exposure. Next slide, please. So these chemicals are bioaccumulative, meaning they tend to build up in people and the environment. And so it is important to understand and prevent exposure. Shown here on the slide are the different ways people could be exposed to PFAS. We are most concerned about exposure via consumption, such as drinking contaminated water or eating fish caught from contaminated waters. So we do issue what we call the Eat Safe Fish guidelines based on the amounts of chemicals found in fish. And I'll get into those details later during my talk. We also see incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust. That's especially a concern in infants and children because of the hand-to-mouth transfer. And some of the other ways you could be exposed are via eating food out of PFAS-containing packages or even using some of the consumer products. And we do get a lot of questions about touching PFAS-containing media or products, but scientific evidence to date and relatively speaking, skin contact is not one of the major ways people are exposed to these chemicals. So it is okay to do dishes, shower or bathe in water that has some PFAS in it, and it is believed not to increase exposure. Next slide, please. So for folks on the phone, this slide shows a graph, with blood PFAS levels in the general US population and how those levels decreased over time, starting from 1999 until 2016. So this graph here, shows how wide uses of PFAS in commerce and their persistence led to measurable levels in blood. And this includes the most recent blood data we have to date from CDC's survey. And this is the largest US general population biomonitoring study and is nationally representative. So results from the survey showed that PFAS were found in blood of nearly 98% of the people tested, and that is virtually every US resident. But the measurement of PFAS in a person's blood by itself does not mean that it can cause disease or adverse effects. Separate studies are required for varying blood levels and to determine whether those levels result in disease or adverse effects. So you can also see from the graph here that PFAS levels in the blood, especially PFOS and PFOA, have declined dramatically since the 2000s. And this is due to discontinued manufacturing or decline in production and use of these chemicals. You can see that the decline is more significant in PFOS. You can tell from the yellow bar in the graph here. But you can also see some marked decrease in PFOA, which is the green bar. Next slide, please. So here are the associated, human health outcomes. And many studies have been conducted in this area, and adverse health effects have been established for exposure to some PFAS chemicals, alike in both human studies and experimental animals. And this slide shows increased risk of health effects associated with higher levels of PFOA or PFOS exposure, as cited by the CDC or ATSDR. For the convenience of those on the phone, I'll just be going over the slide. I'll read what's here. So the adverse health effects include high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, thyroid disease, decreased immune system response to vaccines, reduced fertility, liver damage, chances of higher cholesterol, especially total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, then small decreases in infant birth weight, and also developing certain types of cancer such as kidney and testicular. And this was especially associated with PFOA exposure only. And these effects are supported by, can you go back to the previous slide, please? Yeah. So these effects are supported by studies of different human populations exposed to a few or to many PFAS, including those from populations of high PFAS exposure. And more participants in these human studies, who had high PFAS exposure had adverse health effects than those with lower levels of exposure. And also note that not all participants with high exposure had adverse health outcomes. With that, I'll hand it off to Jonathan Edgerly.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Jonathan Edgerly. I am the environmental manager for the Michigan Army National Guard. Thanks for joining us here today on this virtual town hall. It's a little different. Wish we were all in person doing this like we normally do, but trying to make the best of the situation here and share some information. So what I just want to take is a couple of minutes to talk about how we got to where we're at right now. It was about 4.5 years ago now that the Michigan Army National Guard proactively sampled for PFAS on the airfield after we received some information looking into some historical records of a potential fire crash rescue training area at the airfield. So we sampled for that in the fall of 16, ended up getting some data quality issues with that sampling event. So retested and in the winter of 16/17. And we did find that we had some detects of PFAS in the groundwater there. So winter of 17, we brought in National Guard Bureau, talked to Eagle, DHHS, local health department, et cetera, talked about next steps. That's when we pushed out to the perimeter of the facility. What we believed at that point was downgrading of the area that we had initially sampled to see if we had detects there. And we did find detects at that perimeter, which led us to believe that there may be some off-post effects from the PFAS contamination in the groundwater, which brought us to our first town hall in May of 17. And as you can see from this timeline, there's a lot of information on here. I'm definitely not going to go through all of this. All these green bullets are the town halls. You can see very early on, we aggressively wanted to get out in the community and share everything that we knew and tell you what we're doing and why we're doing it. and talk about kind of the process and how we're going to move forward. There are a lot of bullet points on this timeline, but I will tell you that this is limited to only Michigan Army National Guard and National Guard Bureau effort, which is not the full story. As you can see from this town hall with the full group of individuals here, and you have heard in previous town halls, this is a full team effort with state health, local health, Eagle, DNR, working with us on a lot of these issues. So this is not an all-encompassing timeline, as concurrent effort has definitely been going on with all of our sister agencies as well. So next slide, please. This is a continuation. This takes us from July 18 to current April of 21. As you can see, it has been a while since we have been able to do a town hall due to the world we've been living in kind of the last year. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get in person and have these conversations with the full community. But as you kind of can see in the middle of this group, we really took the opportunity this past year to really stand up our Restoration Advisory Board, which is a group of individuals made up from folks in the community. And as you can see, we had almost monthly meetings virtually over COVID time here to really bring that group up to speed and try to answer as many questions as we can, and kind of have a very good, functional, engaged group there. So we're really proud, and we thank all of our RAB members for their participation and continued activity with that group. So, we're coming to you right now because, as you'll hear a little bit later, there's a lot of work that's planned for the Grayling area this spring and summer. So we want to share with you all of that information. Now, I know, 4.5 years have gone by. We have learned a lot. We know a ton right now, but we are still learning every day with our further investigation. So we appreciate your patience with us. We are here to answer any question that you may have as we continue this methodical process through the CERCLA to ensure that we fully understand what's going on and we can address all issues to the best of our ability. So with that, once again, thank you for joining. I very much appreciate you all joining in this virtual town hall, and I will throw it to Dr. Bonnie Packer with National Guard Bureau. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me all right? Hopefully I'm unmuted at this point. My name is Bonnie Packer. Thank you for the introduction, Jonathan. I work for the Army National Guard, the Cleanup and Restoration Branch, and I'm going to first give you a bit of an overview, and then we'll work with Seisha and Christian Bond to talk about individual sites. So with that, let's move to the next slide. So our top priority is the community's health. It's the thing that's most important to us. And as Jonathan said, we couldn't do this by ourselves. We really appreciate working as a collaborative team, the Army Guard, Michigan Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, Eagle, State Health Department, Local Health Department, and the community members, both those on the RAB as well as those in the rest of the community. And of course, anybody who would like to join the Restoration Advisory Board or even just attend meetings, they're welcome to do so. We really encourage that. At any point during the investigation, the Army National Guard can supply alternate water if we test drinking water and it exceeds the lifetime health advisory. So we've done that in several cases. I'll go over where we are supplying alternate water, where we have time critical removal actions. The last point I want to make on this first overview slide is that we recognize that the state has issued its own standards, and we take those very seriously. At this point, we consider them potential ARARs. When we get to the feasibility study, we will make a determination about whether they apply specifically to each of the sites that we're studying. With that, I want to go to the next slide, where I'm going to go over, as requested by the Restoration Advisory Board, a little bit of the properties of the material that we're talking about. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Per itself refers to the fact that these long chains of carbons have carbons attached to every single fluorine. A lot of these different compounds have what's known as a functional group, the little red dots with the little white dots at the end. Those functional groups are very important to how it behaves in the environment. These chains of carbons can be various lengths. They can be 2 carbons, 4 carbons, 6 carbons, 8 carbons. It turns out that PFOS and PFOA, the ones that Sasha was mentioning, are 8 carbons long, and they have what's called a head and a tail. You can see that in the left-hand figure there. And what's important about this head and tail structure is that the part that's the tail that doesn't have the functional group repels water. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't like the water. And the head end tends to be attracted to water. It's called hydrophilic. So this odd property that one end really likes the water and one end doesn't like the water really controls how it moves through the environment and where we tend to find it. We tend to find it basically attached to the water. It likes to stick to either the surfaces of water or interstitial parts of sand grains. I'll show a figure on the next slide. But this odd structure, the chain length, the fact that that head end can have both a positive or a negative charge, the charge on the end of the head determines how it moves through the environment. It determines its chemical properties and how mobile it is in the environment. Let's go to the next slide. Here I tried to draw a figure. I noticed actually the ITRC has a similar figure. I felt very gratified seeing that this thing that I came up with is something that somebody else came up with as well. What I tried to draw here is a layer cake view blown up several hundred times of what it looks like the sand grains. Those 4 little things that look like pebbles are actually sand grains. Inside those sand grains, you see a little blue area. That's the surface tension water on the inside of sand grains in soil. And the little red squiggly things are my representation of what PFAS looks like. The head end on one end and the tail end on the other. This is what it sort of looks like, I imagine, with the PFAS sticking to the water where it's got the one end and being repelled by the water on the other end. And this is in part the reason why you'll see one of the bullets there says that PFAS tends to be in the upper part of the soil where it's released. So when the AFFF is released to the soil, the top few feet of soil can retain the bulk source of the PFAS for many, many decades. And this is the reason why. Right now, as Sasha mentioned, we're focused on a couple of dozen of these PFASs, but there are many, many other PFASs that exist. At this point, we are focused on the ones where we know the health effects. It doesn't mean that we're not measuring for many other of these. And as time passes, we'll have more and more information about the characteristics and be able to measure for them and understand the toxicology of others as well. As I mentioned, the last thing I think I want to go over on this slide is that some of the PFAS compounds don't start off as PFOS or PFOA. They start off as something called a precursor and then can transform into PFOS or PFOA over time. So I think with that, I think that's about as much chemistry as I want to go over at this point. Of course, if there are questions, I'm glad to answer any at the end. This slide, I don't want to go into too much detail because I think we've pretty much used a slide similar to this at every public meeting. This is the process by which we go through for the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And this law has a process by which we follow so that we don't really miss anything, and so that we go through a very rigorous process of identifying where potential releases are. We do that as part of the preliminary assessment. That preliminary assessment was finished in 2018. we hope that by interviewing people and by visiting the site and collecting as much information as possible at the beginning, that we can go through systematically. And then the next step, the site inspection, where we sample for presence or absence of PFOS and PFOA. And we have a trigger I'll talk about a little bit more. And once we identify that there's presence in this second stage, actually for sampling, and we trigger the next phase is the remedial investigation. And there, what we want is we want to know how much and how far did it get. We want like a three-dimensional picture of what it looks like underground. And then after that, we go to something called the feasibility study. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail, which is how we compare the different remedies and evaluate which ones we think will work best for the community. And after that, we go to a proposed plan. And there we've down selected for one remedy that we think will work. And that proposed plan goes out for public comment. And we generally like to have a public meeting associated with the proposed plan. So that's the general process. After that, the decision itself is documented in something called a decision document or record, or sometimes a record of decision. And then there's a design phase, and then the actual remedial action itself. At any point during all this process, if we find there's nothing there, we can either do no further action, or if we find that there's a risk to human health, we can quickly take an action to supply alternate water. That's a time-critical removal action. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, here's where I want to go in a little bit more detail of what a site inspection is, what our goals are for the site inspection, and then the next step, the remedial investigation. So in the site inspection, as I said before, we're looking for presence or absence. Because there's a process published by the Office of Secretary of Defense, the OSD, they publish screening values for these three chemicals, PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS. Those are what we used as our triggers. PFOA and PFOS triggers in groundwater are 40 parts per trillion. The trigger was recently modified for PFBS, and that new trigger is 602 parts per trillion, which is down by a considerable amount. I think it was well over 1,000 before that. So this is much lower. Not exactly the same as EGLE's published limit, but much lower. The other thing we want to do in our site inspection is we want to develop what's called a conceptual site model. We want to understand how groundwater is moving from our source area away from the source area. Which direction is it going? We want to determine if the Army National Guard is more than likely the source of the contamination. And in the case of the 4 areas we'll talk about tonight, the Army Guard is more than likely the source. And we want to, as I said earliest, we want to identify if there are any immediate risks to drinking water and take an action. So those are our goals for our site inspection. The remedial investigation goals are similar, but a little different. Our primary goal is how far and how deep did the contamination go? We want to know, has it left the installation boundary? And if it's so, how far has it gotten and what are those concentrations? We want to basically draw a map that shows both in plan view and underground where it is. We want to improve our understanding of the groundwater flow, and we want to make sure we understand the extent to which drinking water has been affected. We look carefully at land use, both the current land use and if there's any expected changes to land use. In the case of Grayling, I don't believe there are any intended land use changes. And this is something we haven't talked about yet. As part of the remedial investigation, we do a human health risk assessment, which takes into consideration both the current drinking water risk and the likely future drinking water risk. Again, that direction of groundwater flow is very important. Next slide, please. So the feasibility study, I think this is the first time we're going into any detail on this. The feasibility study, at least for the airfield, is planned start for this winter. Hopefully we'll be nearing the end of our risk assessment at that phase and then be able to start in our feasibility study. And this is the point to which after the Office of Secretary of Defense has determined that these are potential ARRs, we actually look at the state standards to see if they apply to the specific site in question. In this case, the airfield, and then after that, it'll be the cantonment area. We've asked Eagle to please send us a list of applicable and relevant and appropriate requirements, and they have formally done so by letter for both the airfield and the cantonment area. That way, when we are ready to do so, we have the list, and if there's any updates, they can send us updates. So we're ready for our feasibility study as soon as it starts. We evaluate if there's any more information that we need in order to do a treatment or a remedy. We decide if we need what's called a treatability study. So if there's a technology and we don't know for sure if it applies to a site, we need to do a little more study to see if it actually will work. That's called a treatability study. Then, as part of this analysis of the technologies under consideration, we look at a bunch of criteria, and I've listed here the criteria that is used for the feasibility study. The pass-fail criteria are the protectiveness and the compliance. Does the technology, is it protective? And does it comply with the regulations that we've already determined as part of our ARARS analysis? After that, there are balancing criteria. Is the technology both long and short-term effective? It's one thing if it's short-term effective, but we really want any technology to be long-term effective. We want to know if a technology, even if it works, does it have any negative impacts? And if so, what those negative impacts might be. I like to use the example of if you're removing ordnance from a wetland and you're digging it up down to 20 feet, if you dug out the entire wetland, you'd be destroying the wetland. So you'd want to take into consideration that your proposed approach might negatively impact the environment that you're trying to help. Does the technology reduce the toxicity, the mobility, and the volume of the chemical that you're concerned with? Can you actually implement the technology? And then the last balancing criteria is cost. And after all those other criteria, we consider, is the technology going to be something that both the state and the community is going to accept? It's one thing to have something that looks really great, but if you don't think that your community is going to accept it, then it may not work for you. So that's the feasibility study, and you'll probably hear more about that at the next meeting when we get together again as we get closer to this and while we're busy working on it. After that, the proposed plan is the next step. And the proposed plan is basically the chosen remedy that's going to work the best that we found as part of our feasibility study. It focuses on the preferred remedial alternative that you found in your feasibility study. It also presents everything that's come before it: the site inspection for presence or absence, the remedial investigation, your risk assessment. Everything that's come before gets summarized in this proposed plan. And as I said before, this proposed plan goes out for public comment, and we like to have a public meeting associated with it. Next slide, please. With that, I'll hand it over back to Christian.
All right, thank you, Bonnie. I'm Christian Bahn, and I'll start the site investigation updates with Grayling Army Airfield. We'll go through each of the different sites now and explain what's happened since the last town hall meeting. Again, there's my contact information. I'm geologist and site lead for Eagle out of the Gaylord District office. And if we don't get to your question today, or someone can't answer your question, feel free to call or email me and I will get back to you or get you in touch with the person that can answer your question. So Abby Hendershot talked a little bit about the drinking water cleanup criteria. It's important to note that in Grayling at any of our sites, the only criteria that have been exceeded in residential or monitoring well data are PFOA, PFOS, and PFHXS. We're not seeing PFNA. We're not seeing PFHXA in high quantities to exceed the 400,000 parts per trillion criteria. Same for PFBS, and GenX hasn't been found since this is a legacy AFFF release. That GenX is a much newer compound in the environment. So looking at PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS, These are still the drivers for our investigation and have been since the beginning. We see the red dots here are exceedances of any of those criteria. That's where the state can take action and require cleanup. We see contamination or red dots on the southwest, south, and southeast sides of the airfield following the direction of groundwater flow. We've taken a lot of residential samples at this point. We've put in monitoring wells. We've done, and before that, put in vertical aquifer samples so that we could take a boring and take groundwater samples at multiple different depths. So we feel like we are definitely getting our hands around the extent of the contamination, both vertically and laterally. To get our final extent, horizontal and vertical extent of groundwater contamination, we put in additional wells that were finished in February 2020. So a couple on the north side of the airfield, 3 on the southwest side of the airfield, a few on the other side of the river to see what kind of interaction we see with the river, and then a few more that better vertically and horizontally define the main plume coming off of the southeast side of the airfield. We also put in 2 sentinel wells in front of or up gradients of the municipal supply wells in Grayling. The municipal supply wells in Grayling are monitored on a yearly basis as required by Drinking Water Division. And we are monitoring the up gradient or uphill sentinel wells in front of those City of Grayling supply wells on a quarterly basis so that we can track any contaminants that may be heading there. We have not found those, and the last tests from the City of Grayling supply wells were non-detect in January 2021, sorry. In 2020, showing one example of collaboration between Eagle and Army National Guard, the monitoring well data and all data, our entire databases were shared for the on-base work that's been done by Army National Guard and the off-base work that's been done by Eagle. And the data matches up really well and creates a really good complete picture. We're also allowing access to Army National Guard to test any of our monitoring wells. So some of those will be part of their remedial investigation. And they're also using our data to drive their remedial investigation at the airfield. We also did a study in 2019 and 2020 looking at the Asaba River. We sampled surface water and also pore water. When I say pore water, I mean spring water. We actually put a sampler into the spring at each of these locations where you see a dot within a dot, and take a sample directly from groundwater discharging to the Asaba River. And we were pleasantly surprised that we only had 1 exceedance of surface water. That surface water criteria is 12 parts per trillion for PFOS. PFOA is much higher, not that it was detected, but PFOS is the driver of this investigation. And that surface water exceedance can't be correlated back because we don't see any discharge from any of the springs along the Asaba River. So we did that work from Old Dam Road to M72, from I-75 Business Loop up the East Branch. We didn't find any springs up the East Branch to the Grayling Fish Hatchery. We also did work going down the mainstream past the confluence of the East and Main Branch of the Asaba, down all the way to really looking at the Rayburn track, but focusing our spring water sampling closer to the City of Grayling and closer to the known areas of groundwater contamination. And Bonnie Packer will talk a little bit in a little bit about how the Army National Guard is also going to look and verify our study. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bonnie Packer.
Thank you, Christian. So I guess I want to reiterate what Christian said. I don't think we would have as much of a leap forward without the data transfer that we've been doing with Eagle. We've shared our data with them, and likewise, they've shared their data with us. It really is a great opportunity for us to leverage their work and have a much more complete picture. I can't say enough about how happy we are with this collaboration. So the Grayling Army Airfield is approximately, oops, the next slide. Thanks so much. We have had basically 3 separate mobilizations. We started with some push wells on the airfield. And then last year, there was a rapid site characterization demonstration on the airfield. That group also shared their data with us, which is pretty wonderful. I'll show that towards the end of the briefing. And then this summer, we've got a lot of activity on the airfield as well as other areas. We're going to do characterization both on the airfield, monitoring wells and soil sampling, as well as off posts. We're going to do follow-up sampling. I'll talk a little bit about that next. Of drinking water, we'll do surface water sediment. So a lot of activity going on. I'll show some maps. The total time frame we think for the remedial investigation, about 3 years. Generally, they take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. We're sort of smack dab in the middle there in terms of what we think it'll take to finish the remedial investigation. Time critical removal actions, either completed or underway. I think at this point, any homeowners that have been tested, we've actually already supplying bottled water, and in 2 of the cases, the municipal water line connections are already complete. That is for the GAF. The whole house filters are installed, and I believe we have enough data at this point that that we will be sending letters out to those homes for them in the coming weeks so that they can start using those whole house filters. That was a collaboration with Eagle and the Department of Health. We looked at the data, both pre and post filter. We looked at the water chemistry data, and it all looks good. So we're ready to send those letters out with individual homeowner data so that they have their own data. We have one more TCRA, time critical removal action, where we're supplying alternate water, and that's for the cantonment area. That's an area that Christian and I will talk about a little later. That's one house that's receiving alternate water and will also receive a whole house filter. I want to reiterate here that as soon as we test and get a validated response, and when I say a validated, it means that the chemistry data has been looked at and it's been determined by our chemists to be valid and true, we can immediately supply bottled water. And then afterwards, we follow up with a more durable solution. In the case of the prior TCRAs, we talked about municipal water lines where that's appropriate and whole house filters where those are not appropriate. And then the document itself, which is an administrative thing, follows afterwards. It can take several months for us to have a signed document. And anybody who's a part of the TCRA who would like to have a signed document is welcome to ask me. I'm happy to share that. Let's move to the next slide. So Sasha is going to talk a bit about the drinking water sampling. We're going to work in a collaborative way and have been thus far with the Department of Health. They've done several rounds of sampling near the airfield, and we're going to follow up and do our own sampling in an area. Since they've been so gracious and shared their data with us, we know the area that we want to target. We want to target this area that's the pink line that Christian's showing you there. Just for reference there, you see the airfield and you see Business Loop 75 there, and then North Downriver Road is the horizontal that Christian is showing you there. The yellow dotted line is the area for where the municipal water system extent is. So when I talk about the TCRAs and municipal connections, it's within that yellow dotted line. But to follow up here, we plan to send out approximately 240 some odd rights of entry. And when I say rights of entry, I mean a request to sample, to do follow-up sampling in conjunction with the Department of Health. so that when we do get to the feasibility study and we do analyze for state values, that we'll have our own data, it'll be valid. And if there's an opportunity to take an action at that state value, we'll have our data and be able to do so. So if you do get a right of entry request from us and you would like to have your water sampled, please sign it, send it back, and then we will be ready and willing to sample your drinking water this summer. And that data will be kept private. You will have your results sent back to you, and we'll work collaboratively, as I said, with the state health department and local health and Eagle. Next slide, please. This is very similar to the map that Chris John showed. Not surprising since they've shared their data with us, and likewise. The visualization here is basically to help you understand where the release areas are, which are the sort of darker orange areas. Again, for reference, I-75 business loop is the vertical there. That's on the right-hand side of the airfield. And then North Downriver Road is the horizontal at the bottom there. So the sort of dark orange areas are in the middle of the airfield. And those squiggly lines that are basically from the upper right to the sort of lower left, those are basically the elevation lines of the groundwater, so that we understand, as I say, the direction of groundwater flow. You can see those big blue arrows are the direction of groundwater flow. And the other thing I guess I want to point out here is all the little dots with numbers next to them. Those are the places we intend to sample as part of the remedial investigation. So some of these are wells we plan to put in. And many of these, thanks to Eagle for putting those wells in and letting us sample those, will be part of our remedial investigation as well. In addition to groundwater sampling, that we'll be doing source area soil sampling, and we'll, I think in the next chart, I can show you a similar chart to what Chris John showed. We plan to do surface water and sediment sampling so that we understand the risk to surface water as well. So that's pretty much the same visualization there. You can see where the source areas are on the airfield, the little orange areas and the different release areas. You can see it's not just one or two of them, there's several of them. See if there's anything else I want to point out on this map. Well, if I've left anything off, I'm sure there'll be questions. We can come back to it. Let's move to the next one. This is my last slide for the Grayling Army Airfield. I want to talk a little bit about technology demonstrations. We like to bring as much innovative technology as we can to Camp Grayling. We had a mobile laboratory come to the airfield, and that data was shared with our contractor. It was very, very helpful. It helped us really understand the source areas and how it was moving towards the installation boundary. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. On the right there, there's a little map inset that has the numbers 3 to 3' on it. If you can imagine from that map view, if you could take a knife and slice into that 3 to 3' and then look at the cutaway version of that, that's what's shown in the middle here, those two pictures. One is the picture of the definitive method where we got the mobile lab to give us the actual results, as same as it would be as if it went to a fixed laboratory. And the bottom is when they did an accelerated method. The two maps are essentially the same. And what they show is that there are two different plumes that are headed towards the eastern boundary of the airfield. The red areas are the sort of more concentrated areas of PFAS. It helped us understand where it is at a very detailed level. That publication is available to the public. It's in the little references at the bottom. It's in the remediation journal, and we're very grateful to that team for coming to Grayling and sharing all the data with us and publishing it so that the public can have it as well. The next, the next technology demonstration that will come to Grayling is something called the vertebrae horizontal well system. This is going to go into one of the source areas, hopefully at the airfield. We hope that it'll come in the fall of 2021, in other words, in a few months. And it will help us understand how fast the PFAS is leaving the source areas, moving to groundwater, and also help us understand what treatments will work best for the source areas. And lastly, I've put in a request for demonstration funding to look at incremental sampling at the airfield to help us really understand the soil source areas and what's going to work best. This is very important for us to, again, understand the flux from surface to groundwater, and understand what the risk is to groundwater. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Bonnie. And with that, we'll jump to Camp Grayling Cantonment and Lake Marguerite. Again, I'm Christian Bond, your geologist and site lead for Eagle. Again, like I said before, the main drivers for this investigation are PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS. Those are mainly found in AFFF or Class B foam or firefighting foam that you hear about. And, you know, this shows areas of exceedances. There are, 12 homes that have exceeded in the Lake Marguerite area, and the majority of those homes are at the southeast end of the lake, and they exceed for all three of those criteria. We've also sampled pore water and surface water. Pore water, again, we're testing springs that are coming out of Lake Marguerite. And those results have varied from fall 2018 to 2019. And all exceedances have been on the south end of the lake. And some of the variation may be caused, Bonnie said before when she explained the chemistry, how PFAS sits on the surface of the water because it has that hydrophobic head. That sticks up out of the water. So it can be blown around by wind. And if it's concentrated, you may find foam on the downwind side of the lake on the shore. So all 4 exceedances of surface water have been near areas of known groundwater contamination. So it does look like PFAS is discharging to the lake. And if I go to the next slide, we also wanted to see, is anything leaving Lake Marguerite? There weren't, high concentrations at the north end of Lake Marguerite. There actually weren't any exceedances of surface water, but we still wanted to see what could leave the lake and go down Portage Creek. So we did our outflow study. We took 5 sediment cores from Portage Creek. These were down 3 feet. So we got, that really silty sediment that's, in this outflow, and took multiple sample intervals from each sediment core. All the sediment was non-detect for PFAS, and all sediment samples that we've taken from Lake Marguerite shores have also been non-detect for PFAS. We've also taken multiple surface water samples downstream of the dam to see if anything's leaving in the water. And we have not seen any exceedances of PFOS, just like we haven't seen that on the north side of Lake Marguerite. If I go to the next slide, I said earlier, there's an area of focus at the southeast end of Lake Marguerite near the Cantonment fence line. We had 5 wells in initially, and we put in 5 additional well clusters. So I say well clusters, there's multiple wells at each location, so we can get multiple samples at multiple depths. And we've done this over quarterly sampling intervals. So initially we had 3 wells that exceeded and multiple homes that exceeded our drinking water cleanup criteria. And we wanted to look up gradients. So we talked to the Army National Guard and asked, can we install monitoring wells at the fence line to see if it's possibly coming from up gradient of this area? They allowed us to come on base and install wells. So we installed these 5 additional wells, 1 along Borchers Way. If I go to the next slide, these have shown higher concentrations near the Cantonment fence line, suggesting a source at the Cantonment. And we shared this data again with Army National Guard, and they're going to be looking for a source up gradient of this that wasn't initially identified in the PA report because there was no known release or known use of PFAS in this area. So Bonnie will talk a little bit more about that when I transition to her. We're also going to, this is my last Eagle slide. I talked a little bit less today, so and there's a reason for this. We're continuing to transfer the off-base investigations to Army National Guard. And Eagle will continue to fill in data gaps, such as we did with the Sable River sampling, such as we did with the Lake Marguerite outflow sampling. And we're also going to continue to review Army National Guard reports and provide input for work plans in a timely manner so that we, if we think something's missing, we let them know. They allow us to put in comments for each of these reports. And actually our RAB has been able to give comments for each of the reports as well, or at least the last round of reports. We're also coordinating efforts with Army National Guard and DHHS so that we don't duplicate work or replicate work, and that we allow a seamless transition. And we're going to continue to provide updates to the public through the Grayling Restoration Advisory Board, community meetings, and public inquiries. So any phone calls and emails I get, I try to get to those as soon as I can. With that, I will transition over to Bonnie to talk about the on-base work done by the Army National Guard.
Thanks, Christian. It's a nice segue here. So I'm going to start to the left here. Christian just talked a little bit about the wells that are at the boundary. Christian, if you could just use your pointer and point to the boundary wells again on that left-hand figure. We also sampled along the green line there, the boundary wells as part of our site inspection, and did get the same results that Eagle got. And we're able to use those as a basis for moving that area off already into the remedial investigation. So we essentially leveraged their work again and moved ourselves forward in time in order to move that process along. On the right-hand figure, you can see that our conceptual site model for how groundwater moves is the same as Christian mentioned. Groundwater moves from topographic highs, higher areas towards the lake. You can see all those little blue arrows. I don't think there's anything else I really want to mention on that figure. I guess on the left-hand figure, that purple area is the same purple area that Christian mentioned that they've done their off-site investigation. At this point, we're only at the point where we're doing on-post investigations. We may get to the point where we do off-site investigation as well, but we're not there yet. So let's move to the next slide. So here we are. This is a figure from the preliminary assessment for all the areas that we wanted to investigate as part of the site inspection for presence or absence. You can see we call them areas of interest or AOIs. The areas that are circled, there are 3 of them there, AOI 20, 17, and 16 are circled because we were asked by Eagle to please take some additional samples. We didn't find anything in our initial sampling. But we are going to do some supplemental sampling because we could probably try a little harder to make sure that when we say there's nothing there, that there truly is nothing there. The other areas have individual areas that are moving forward. Let's move to the next slide, I think. That's gonna be helpful. Okay, yeah. So the way this chart works is a black dot means that we found something in groundwater that triggers the screening level. So at the top there where it says 14 former fire barn, that's the first row. That black dot means that we found something in groundwater at the former fire barn that moves that area from the site inspection to the remedial investigation. So that is gonna move forward. Building 228Q, nope, we didn't. And same for the parade grounds. But when you get down to 15 wash rack, again, another black dot, that area did trigger the in groundwater the OSD screening value of 40 parts per trillion. Same with building 600. But again, I have the arrows off to the left there to show those are areas where we're going to do some additional sampling because we either didn't get groundwater because we had hit refusal with our drill rig, or we only took a few samples and we could take a few more. So we're going to do some additional sample there. And the very last row is the main gate area. And as I said, we did take those boundary well samples and shows that we need to do some investigation up gradient, like Christian mentioned, to see where the actual release area is, because we were not aware that there was a release in that area. None of our interviewees or none of the documents that we uncovered indicated that the main gate area had a release, but we will find it as part of the remedial investigation. Next slide, please. So the site inspection activities are gonna be ongoing this spring in May timeframe. And that will be followed up by June and July remedial investigation. So we're gonna take those initial SI samples and then we're gonna roll right into the RI for the areas where we already know we need to. The dots on this figure show where we're going to take additional samples and they correspond to the very last figure I just showed. Those are the areas that need to move from the SI to the RI that we know of right now. So you see there's some along the lake there. I think that is where there was a wash rack. And then there's an area AOI 14. That's where the former fire barn is. And then again, up to the top of the figure where the boundary wells are, this because we don't really know where the X marks the spot is, we basically have spread those wells out just to try to find out where is the most likely highest concentration. So hopefully we'll be able to find it with those wells. Next. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Sesha Kalakuri, our state toxicologist.
Thank you, Bonnie. So now I'll go over the summary of results from the drinking water well resampling that the State Health Department conducted this past summer. Next slide, please. So the purpose of resampling drinking water wells is to be protective of human health, since PFAS fluctuations in drinking water wells is unknown. And we've so far completed only one round of resampling and hope to do at least 2 other rounds of resampling, at which point we look at all the data gathered over time, which will help us make a final public health determination. And data from monitoring wells that Dr. Packer and Christian went over is used for the characterization of the contaminated plume, such as its vertical and horizontal extent. And this resampling is also different from what the Army National Guard is planning to do this summer. So as Dr. Packer previously mentioned, the Guard's focus is on homes that are at or above the state's criteria and any surrounding homes within 800 feet of those, whereas our resampling is extended to anyone within the investigation area. Next slide, please. So apart from sampling your water for PFAS, we also did consider several variations this time. For example, for a chosen subset of homes, we sent samples to 2 different labs for analysis, since the 2 labs test for some of the same and some different PFAS. And we want to be sure we are not finding any new PFAS that we haven't tested for earlier. And if at all we do, we make sure to include them in the subsequent rounds of resampling. And then we also targeted a subset of homes for post-filter sampling, and the results show that the point-of-use filters that we typically offer, they seem to be doing a good job in reducing those PFAS levels. And we've also analyzed, both the filtered and the unfiltered water for general chemistry parameters like pH, conductivity, nitrates, sulfates, and some others. But this is mainly to understand if water chemistry in the area interferes with the functioning of the filtration system, that we offer. Again, based on the data that we have collected, it doesn't seem to be interfering with the functioning of the filtration system. Next one, please. And when it comes to evaluating drinking water test results, we look at all the available exposure guidelines, such as the drinking water cleanup criteria and the public health screening levels that the State Health Department has developed. And to guide our public health actions, we use the lowest of these 2 sets of numbers, and we are calling it the PFAS comparison values. Now, levels above the comparison values do not mean that it can result in health effects, but it means that further evaluation is needed. So we look at the entire package, which is the site-specific information, the toxicology of the chemicals, and then that'll help us drive our public health recommendation. Now, you may not have health problems from PFAS now or in the future, but if you drink water with elevated PFAS levels, which is our major route of concern, as I mentioned earlier. Over time, you could be more likely than the average person to develop some health problems in the future. Next one. And again, just as I mentioned, the comparison value is only one of the many considerations that is used to evaluate the residential well results or make public health recommendations. The other considerations include, looking at the available site-specific information, such as what we know about the source, its strength or extent of the contamination, the geology in the area, the groundwater flow direction, etc. And we do not just look at individual test results, but also evaluate all results in the sampling area collectively to make the appropriate recommendations. Next one, please. Excuse me. And based on our evaluation of the results, we could either say that your well water is okay for consumption, or we recommend that you use a filter as a precaution, since we are not sure how PFAS levels might fluctuate over time. And once we make that recommendation, we ask that you continue using that filter until we come to a point where we are ready to make the final public health determination. And apart from that, we also provide outreach and education with respect to PFAS and drinking water. The next one, please. So when we make recommendations for filtration systems, we either offer, the ones that are certified for removal of PFOA or PFOS, and the removal rate is up to 96%. You'll see an NSF P473 certification on the manufacturer's label, and it is basically a 3-stage granular activated carbon system that goes underneath your kitchen sink. Next one. So here's the residential well sampling summary for each of the Grayling areas. So first I'll go with the Grayling Army Airfield. And I want to mention that we sent out, recruitment letters to the individual homeowners in the beginning, even before we came out to collect the samples. And the local health did a press release to announce our resampling effort. And our sanitarians then followed up via phone calls to schedule the sampling appointments for approximately 1,050 homes for all 3 Grayling PFAS sites combined. And for the Grayling Army Airfield area, we were able to recruit about 559 homes out of 600 something that were previously sampled. And the results were non-detect for all PFAS for 346 homes, and about 150 homes had detections below our comparison value that I showed previously. And there were about 57 homes that were at or above 1 or more of the comparison values. And this data is consistent with what the GARD or Eagle have previously identified. So no significant changes at this point, but can't draw any conclusions as to final public health determination yet. So we'll continue resampling. The next one. So here's the summary for the Lake Margaret area. So in this area, we were able to recruit about 455 out of 490 something that were previously sampled. So pretty good turnaround in both the areas. And again, mostly non-detects, about 385 and 57 that were below our comparison values, and 13 homes at or above 1 or more of our comparison values. Again, pretty consistent with the previous data. However, I just want to add that there were some, isolated wells with increased total PFAS concentrations, and that can be attributed to, the additional PFAS that we analyzed for. I don't know if you noticed in the previous slide, but MDHHS tested for 24 or 28 different PFAS this past summer. But anybody who's been tested in the past, I'm thinking 2017 by Eagle or the GARD Bureau, it might be for 18 PFAS. So when you add up those numbers, you might see that that might have increased. It's because we tested for more different PFAS. The next one. So for the Mates area, we resampled 18 out of 23 wells previously sampled, and only 3 homes had, detections, and that too below our comparison value. So this is a pretty low impact area compared to the other 2. And no PFOA or PFOS were detected in any of the wells. And the highest total PFAS detections too were only about 7.4 parts per trillion. With that, I'm gonna turn it back to Bonnie.
Thanks, Seisha. Even though this slide says North and South Post, I think on the next slide, I'm going to start with a mention of the Mates. right there, see where the little red dot is in the inset there? That's the green line is the entirety of Camp Grayling. It's a tiny little map. I just want to point out where the mates area is. It's right where the cursor is located there. That mates area, the site inspection is final for that. Although range 30 itself didn't have a detection over the screening limit, the actual wash rack where the cursor was did have an exceedance, and that is going to move to remedial investigation. And we're plan to award the remedial investigation for that mates area coming up this fall. So look for a start. We will start off by doing work planning as we always do. And as soon as we have a draft final to send to Eagle for their review, we will do so. And after they've had their review, if the Restoration Advisory Board would like to review it, then they can review it as well. So that's just a status update for the mates area. I don't have a lot to say, except for one last thing I do want to say is that we did also do sampling down gradient of the mates area, and we did not find anything of concern. As exactly the way Sasha just mentioned in her prior slide. So with that, I'm going to talk about what we call the north and south post areas. It's everything that we found in the preliminary assessment that we haven't yet sampled. So because they're sort of scattered across both north and south post of Grayling, we're going to basically focus on all those areas and finish up sampling for presence or absence at all of those areas. So on the right there, you can see the range 40 complex. That's the upper red box. The blue arrow is in the direction of groundwater flow. And you can see a bunch of little dots there along basically the southeastern boundary down gradient there. Those are where we plan to sample for presence or absence to see. In the preliminary assessment, there was an indication that something called wet water was used in that area. And it wasn't clear whether wet water was just soapy water or whether it was Class A foam that was used, and Class A foam doesn't have PFAS in it. Class B foam does. We just want to be sure that there's no releases there, so we will be sampling in those areas where they talked about wet water being used to prevent fires. To the right, lowest right-hand corner there's something called the former northern fob. We will be sampling there as well. There you can see there's three tiny little red dots there. We plan to take those three groundwater samples there. On the left-hand side of the figure is Lewiston Grade Road. I want to remind the audience that Eagle already did general sampling of homeowner wells in that area and did not find anything. But again, there was evidence in our interviews along Lewiston Grade Road that there was dust suppression used. They used what they called wet water again. And since we don't know what was in that water, we will be sampling to make sure that there were no releases along Lewiston Grade Road. Lewiston Grade Road on the left leaves the airfield and moves up towards the mates and range 30. So that's AOY 9, and that'll be also sampled in the upcoming field season as part of our spring sampling. I think those are all the areas that are on this slide. Let's move to the next one. A bunch of areas described here. You can see on the left, there's Howes Lake. And again, the blue arrows show the direction of groundwater flow, and it's the same story here. There was training, there was some evidence from interviews that they used wet water, and we want to be sure that there's no PFAS impacting this area. And so we will be sampling the down gradient portion there to make sure that we don't miss any PFAS releases there at this, what we call area of interest number 19 at Howes Lake. Let's see, on the right-hand portion of this figure, there are three other general areas. There's range 15. All these numbers are very confusing, I'm sure, for you guys as well. Referred to as AOI 13, area of interest 13. And again, in the down gradient direction of groundwater flow, we will be taking some samples to make sure that any wet water used there didn't have PFAS. Same with AOI 12, which is range 21. And range 20, again, wet water, we'll be sampling to make sure that there are no impacts. Same with range 8 and range 3A and 3B. All that, it's a lot of sampling for this spring. It's actually ongoing as we speak. They started the process this week of setting up to sample, and wherever the training allows, they will be sampling this spring in the coming weeks. I think that is scheduled to be done in the next, say, 3 or 4 weeks. So you'll probably see lots of activity, lots of people sampling, lots of drill rigs in town this spring and summer. Next slide. I think this is my very last slide. I just want to go over some resources for those who want to learn more about PFAS. I'll start at the top, the National Guard link. This is our public affairs website where we hope to eventually have our all of our documents posted. Right now you can find all of our administrative record at the Kirtland Community College webpage. I'm pretty sure Chris John's gonna show you a link there. That is part of our process for the CERCLA process to make sure that in a local area near the installation that all the documents that we produce as part of this process are available to the public. The next set of links is part of the DENEX system. This is the Office of Secretary of Defense. All of the documents that indicate what guidance we have and what the policies are and what the screening limits are. There, you can find all those documents there at those websites. The next set of links I think these are very good educational information. The Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, that's a bit of a mouthful. It's a research arm of the DoD, and a lot of money is being poured into PFAS research. And in fact, that mobile laboratory that was funded by ESTCP, and we're happy to have as much of that technology come to our Michigan sites as possible. I highly encourage you to go to that website and dig through all the interesting research ongoing. Lastly, the Interstate Regulatory Council, ITRC. Several of us have used figures from that webpage. There are fact sheets there and a lot of really good information. So that's a really great resource for those who want to learn more. So with that, I'll hand it back over. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bonnie, again. So I'm going to go over the Michigan Fish Consumption Advisory Program. Now, along with the residential well results, we also evaluate data from fish sampled either by Eagle or the DNR, and then we set consumption advisories based on those results. So for more details, you can go check out our website at eatsafefish.com. The next one. So here too, I'm going to go by, each Grayling PFAS site and explain what fish we've collected and what that translates to. So we evaluate PFAS levels in fish fillets along with other chemicals such as, mercury and PCBs, and then issue fish consumption guidelines as needed, which would include a do not eat fish advisory if the levels were higher concerning. Now we test for 16 different PFAS, but PFOS is the only PFAS that is detected very frequently and is always found at higher concentrations. And so it drives our consumption guidelines. And the other PFAS are not detected very frequently and are found in very low amounts, if at all they are. So fish samples from the Osable River were taken in 2017 near the Old Dam Road and below the confluence of the main stream and East Branch. And only brown trout showed detections of PFOS, but not high enough to warrant a fish advisory. So the statewide mercury advisory is still in effect. Same for the Northern Pike. Mercury is the driving chemical, meaning the chemical causing the Michigan serving recommendation. Next one. And at Lake Margaret, fish tissue samples were taken in 2017 from bluegill, sunfish, large and smallmouth bass, and walleye. And fillets of all fish except walleye, which I kind of bolded here on the slide, have been tested for mercury and PFAS, but only bluegill and sunfish contain high enough concentrations of PFOS that drive our consumption guidelines. And all other fish continue to have a statewide mercury advisory. The next one. So this area shown here on the map was targeted for deer sample collection during spring or summer 2018 due to the proximity of the PFAS contaminated surface water. The next one. And 20 deer from the Grayling area, the area that I showed you earlier, were collected and harvested, and all deer are tested for chronic wasting disease, and bovine tuberculosis before they are analyzed for PFAS. And results show non-detect to very low levels of PFAS in deer meat. And the highest was only about 1.65 parts per billion for PFOS. And it was the only chemical detected. And levels this low are not considered a health concern. For perspective, we do issue a do not eat advisory when the levels are over 300 parts per billion. So considering that it was 1.65 parts per billion for PFOS that was found in deer meat. Now, however, MDHHS recommends that you do not eat kidneys or liver of any deer because PFAS and other chemicals are stored in these organs. And these organs are called biased filters since they filter out contaminants in the body. So just refrain from consuming any deer meat for that matter, regardless of whether they have concerning PFAS levels or not. The next slide, please. So shown here are pictures of foam, and this foam is different from the AFFF foam that was used at the fire training areas at the airfield. Here we are talking about foam on water bodies, which can either be naturally occurring or PFAS containing. So we can tell a PFAS containing foam from a naturally occurring one, usually by its bright white color. It tends to pile up like shaving cream and it gets blown off because it's really lightweight. It can also be a bit sticky, whereas the naturally occurring foam is tinted and is usually due to decomposition of aquatic plants that contain, the organic compounds, and which when released into the water, it alters the characteristics of the water and kind of foams up. You can also check out our MPART webpage if you want to get into more details. The next one, please. So as a general advice, since summer is almost here, any kinds of foam, PFAS or not, should be avoided. Again, amounts of PFAS in foam are usually higher than in surface water. And, we are concerned about swallowing foam, which could be a health risk. So swimming or bathing in the water is not a concern, but we are concerned about incidental swallowing of foam with high or concerning levels of PFAS. Now, PFAS do not easily absorb through the skin, as I mentioned earlier, but hand-to-mouth behavior in children is a concern, and it creates an ingestion problem. So it is best to rinse off foam after contact and bathe or shower after, the day's activities. And MDAR2 recommends you do the same for your dog because dogs can potentially swallow foam that's collected in their fur. So they should be thoroughly rinsed with fresh water after they come in contact with foam. And it is okay to rinse it off in the lake or river when you come in contact with foam, but away from it because amounts of PFAS in surface water, again, are usually lower than what we see in, the foam itself. The next one, please. So this is the Restoration Advisory Board, and this is a group that consists of, members from all the involved agencies and community members in the Grayling area. And this is different from the Citizens Advisory Work Group that Director Hendershot mentioned, earlier during her talk this evening. So this is very specific to the Grayling area, Camp Grayling, and the group meets once every 2 months. And then the community members that are part of the group, they act as liaisons between, the community itself that are not part of the group and the agency members. And, we also have a public website that's updated with meeting notes and reports. You can definitely look up on Google for Grayling RAP and it should show up and it'll take you to, the Kirtland Community College where all our documents are, kind of saved. And I just want to thank all the members of the RAP for being a very critical part of this investigation and, kind of giving our inputs. So thank you for all the community members who are part of these almost monthly meetings. With that, I'm going to end my talk and I'm going to turn it back to Les.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Thank you, team. Just wanted to go over quickly the housekeeping guidelines we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, and just a reminder for the folks who may have joined after we started. If you have questions tonight concerning the topics that were covered this evening, please feel free to type a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, you may choose to raise your hand electronically by selecting the hand icon. And for our guests who are on the phone, who are listening by phone only, you can electronically raise your hand by selecting the pound and the number 2 sign. that's the pound sign and the number 2. So with that, if the panel is ready, we do have some questions that did come in during the webinar. And I'm going to go back here a bit just to make sure that all of our guests hear these answers. So, Sasha, I'm going to bring you up first. There's a question about the micrograms per liter, translating that to parts per trillion. For our guests, could you just provide us with that conversion?
Sure. So 1 microgram per liter basically translates to 1,000 parts per trillion. I don't know how much, why that question came up, but if that answers your question, you just have to multiply the microgram per liter by 1,000 times to convert it to parts per trillion.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sasha. Next question is there data to describe the PFOS and PFAS contamination are there any impacts to the Grayling municipal water supply with PFOS and PFAS? Is there any data available?
Yeah, so all drinking water data in the state is on so every municipality was part of a statewide sampling. And then that, sorry, I start my video here. That's all been posted on the MPART website. If you go to MPART website, go to drinking water, any municipality that has public supplies is listed there with results. And some of those municipal supplies based on results may have been kicked into a sampling schedule for PFAS. In Grayling, it's on an annual basis due to a detection of PFHXS, which has never been more than, I believe, single digits parts per trillion, and that PFHXS drinking water cleanup criteria is 51 parts per trillion.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Hey, why don't you stay with me for a little bit for these next 2? How do we compare the format of the original residential well test to the recent test? Is part per trillion is not listed in the most recent results?
So I think Sasha can better answer that one.
Okay.
I'll take that. Thank you. Just want to make a correction to what Christiane posted. So 1 part per trillion translates to 1 nanogram per liter. So probably in your results letter or your lab report, you must see, NG per L, which is nanogram per liter, which is nothing but parts per trillion. So that's probably why, but we do compare, even if it's in a different unit, we always make that conversion and make sure that we are comparing apples to apples. So we always, evaluate those results in parts per trillion and compare it to the past.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This concerns the arrows that were depicting groundwater in the presentations this evening. The arrows depicting direction of groundwater flow are different lengths. Does a longer arrow indicate faster groundwater flow rates, or was the rate of groundwater flow not part of the calculation? I think some of those were in Dr. Packer.
Yeah, I'll take that, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was no calculation of velocity of a groundwater flow. What we did there is just try to depict, my arrows might have been a bigger and fatter, just so that the audience could see them, but no velocity calculations at this time.
Okay, all right.
And I can add to that a little bit. On the Grayling Army Airfield site, you did calculate some of the hydraulic conductivities, which is how easily water can move through the subsurface. And it does look like higher concentrations of PFAS are in areas with higher hydraulic conductivities, or areas where water can more easily flow through the subsurface.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Next question is, how many whole home filters have you installed and what areas are they in? Do we know how many?
Yeah, I think
sure.
the best person to answer that would be either Jonathan or Patty.
Okay.
Hey, this is Jonathan. I can take that one. So yeah, we have 14 different facilities with filters installed currently, and those are all around and adjacent to the airfield. And we have one additional home, as Bonnie mentioned in her TICRA slide, that is near the adjacent to the cantonment main gate that is on its way to getting a whole home filter. We're working with the designer and the plumber and the construction company right now to finalize the design and then just figure out a time that's convenient for that homeowner to get into that home and get that filter installed.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next question concerns the most recent well water sample results. When will the results from the most recent well water sampling be made available?
So I just went over the summary for each of the Grayling areas based on the data that we collected this past summer. But we've also mailed out results letters to each individual homeowner with their lab report and all the different parameters we tested for, if applicable. So that should have been in a letter that was mailed out to you. But if you haven't received one, feel free to either shoot me an email or call me. I mean, I can put my contact information here in the chat for all of you. And yeah, I'll look up your results and make sure that you get that information right away.
Thank you, Stacia.
Hey,
Next,
let me add on to
Oh,
that,
sure.
Stacia, just real quick. Just so everybody knows, there was a big batch mailing out for the Grayling area, and about 500 letters went out the door last week. So give it a week, and if you don't get your letter, then call Stacia or email her, because a lot of that stuff literally should be in the mail. Not to sound like, the canned answer, but I do know that they send out a lot of letters specifically on this project in the last week.
Thanks for adding that.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Stacia. This next question concerns observation on one of the slides, the cross-section. With the example shown of cross-section of 3-3, Dr. Packer mentioned 2 plumes. Based on the graphics, is it correct to understand those plumes are vertically stacked in the same horizontal position?
John, would you mind scrolling back to that? I think it will be easier for the audience. Thank you so much. Yeah, so look at the top of the 2 colorful cross sections there. They're like layer cake views. And there are 2 source areas in the middle of the airfield here that are not close to one another. I mean, I guess from the tiny little picture on the right, you might think that they're close to each other, but they're not like buildings that are right next to each other. So it turns out that by the time those 2 plumes move down gradient, one is lower vertically than the other. I hope I answered that question. Can you read it one more time, Les, for me to make sure?
Sure, absolutely. You mentioned there's a mention of 2 plumes. Based on the graphics, is it correct to understand those plumes are vertically stacked in the same horizontal position?
Yes, the short answer is yes, they are vertically stacked. One is above the other.
Okay, because that was the next part of the question, is one deeper in the ground than the other?
Yes, the one that looks like it's the lower layer cake is, well, no, a little bit higher there.
Okay.
Yep, there's two big ones there. One is higher and one is lower.
Okay. Dr. Packer, there's a last part of this is could these plumes be due to event-based releases spaced in time?
We don't think so. Based on what we know from the interviews, from the preliminary assessment, it seems like these 2 areas in particular were used over a long period of time, generally about the same time. In fact, the fire truck was parked in 2 different areas, one where it was sort of indoors at night and one where it was outdoors during the day. So we think it was essentially over the course of time that these 2 areas had releases approximately simultaneous.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Packer. The next question is, you have concentrated around Lake Marguerite. How widespread is this outside of the area? The investigation.
I can quickly talk about that. So really, we haven't, since groundwater flow is towards the lake, we've really confined, the area that we have PFAS around Lake Marguerite. I mean, you can see some green dots outside of the area where some samples were taken. But, the concentrated area is here at the southeast side of the lake. Maybe Bonnie Packer can talk a little bit about, or she already did, about looking at, other areas that were identified in the preliminary assessment report.
Okay, thank you, Christian. All right, next question. This is more of an agriculture related question. Having a farming, have any farming crops or livestock been contaminated by PFAS? Is there any data? Is there any data statewide?
Not that I'm aware of, but I know we are doing several pilot studies, like a garden study, trying to collect some home gardening, home produce, and then trying to test for PFAS, like what's in the soil, what's in the plants. And I know that we are trying to see how it transfers, to livestock, what's in the feed, and, if it gets into cow's milk. And yeah, there's not a whole lot of science on that. So I don't know, Bill, do you want to take, or Abby, if you have more information on that?
Yeah, I'll just add that we've got a few different investigation type things going on, but we don't have enough data to really put together, comprehensive type recommendations for staff yet. I think that's part of what we're trying to gather additional information, both from the toxicological side, the human health side, as well as the agricultural side, the crop side, what is it happens in the soil, how much of it's taken up in the plants, which plants take up which parts of it, does it end up in the kernel or does it end up on the root system? There's a lot we just don't know. And so I think it's pretty early for us to make recommendations, but we do know that there is some ability of the PFAS, depending on the size of the molecule, because we're talking about PFOA, or PFOS and PFOA, which have 8 carbons. Some of them only have 4. And so those all act a little bit differently inside of plants. And so there's still a lot of research to be done, but I'll let Bill add into that as far as the human health part of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say the question mentioned farming and that type of thing. Sasha was referring to a couple of small, I don't want to call them studies. It's just kind of trying to get information to help us understand a little bit more that DHHS is doing. And we're sampling home garden products. So we were looking at a couple of PFAS sites where they have PFAS contamination in the groundwater, and the people historically have used that water for watering gardens. So we've gone out and we've collected samples from the garden as well as soil samples. We're still waiting on that data. And again, as Abby, there's so many factors that go into plant uptake of PFAS and that, the science is still very young, still trying to understand. But like I said, DHHS is just looking at some garden products and just trying to see what, if anything, we can observe or find. So,
Thanks, Bill. All right. Next question concerns reporting and water collection. The question says, I have never received my PFAS report from water collected in August. Should I call the health department or another agency? I live on the southeastern side of the lake, and my property could be the off-site house fire. I'm very concerned about the firefighting foam that was used.
So I would definitely ask you to send me an email with your address, and I can look up the information and see what went wrong, or why you didn't get the results letter. So that's where I would start.
Okay, thank you, Stacia. Christiane, I know you want to go out to the MPart page. I just want to give, while you're getting ready for that or loading that up, I just want to give our attendees just some quick stats. We had somewhere roughly close to 80 attendees on the meeting tonight. We had about 5 attendees that were listening by phone, which we have actually still about 4 of them are still with us. For those of you that are on the phone, if you do have a question for the panel, please feel free to push the pound and the 2 key on your phone to raise your hand. We'd be happy to unmute your phone line to ask your question. Christiane, if you want to go ahead and do your MPart presentation, I will pass the microphone back to you.
Sure thing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So michigan.gov/PFAS response. So you can type in MPART into Google and this is going to come up. So here you can get information on drinking water. Like we said, all public drinking water supplies are available. Those results are available here. You can browse all of them throughout the state. You can look at different investigations here. So if you go to PFAS sites and scroll through those, you can find Camp Grayling and Lake Marguerite with all the information here, includes up-to-date timeline, as well as all sampling results, a short table summary of sampling results. Grayling Army Airfield is there as well. And we have the Mates facility and also featured here. And then I quickly wanted to mention the RAB website as well. So if in Google you type in RAB, R-A-B website Grayling, it's going to be the first result that comes up. It's actually the first 2 results that come up. If you go to that page here, so much information here. You can read about the RAB. There's documents of interest. So every report that's been put out by Eagle is available here. And you can also find information on TICRAs put out by Army National Guard. There's heat maps available. So this is a lot of information here to look at as well. So these are all really, important resources that the public can use.
Christiane, can you go back to the main MPART page? I just want to show folks one more things. On that main page, you'll come to this and there'll be popular pages there. Can you click the Citizens Advisory Work Group? There is a link here right on our main web page for the Citizens Advisory Work Group. We have meetings that are every second Tuesday night of the month. We do a Citizens Advisory Work Group, and the mission really is to make sure that we've got good engagement with our public, to make sure we understand what the needs are. And so I would just encourage you, if you've thought about it, to go ahead and click on, there's the COG calendar there, as well as the charter membership registration. Go down a little bit farther, right there. There's the calendar, and you can sign up to be an official member, or you can just sign up to come and listen. The link is right there in the calendar webpage, so you don't have to sign up ahead of time. Just feel free to join us. And then there's also the subcommittees, as well as the main MPART work group. So we usually have some speakers, have some topical type information, but also have some good conversation about what's going on around the state, as well as what people are seeing. So just really encourage people to join us for that. And then there is I'll just throw a little promotional out here. We're also doing a Drinking Water Awareness Week next week. And so Wednesday, May 5th, we'll be doing a PFAS 101 for homeowners and for PFAS in your drinking water wells. So join us for that. You can find that again on the michigan.gov. That one's under Clean Water Advocate page, but I think if you just click on the Drinking Water Awareness, you should be able to find that as well. So just a little plug for that. Thanks,
One more
Christiane.
thing to add, you can go to the Eagle YouTube channel where all public meetings are posted. So this meeting is recorded and will be posted, so you can send that link to others that may not have been able to attend today.
Exactly. And the drinking water, for those of you who asked about the Grayling drinking water, municipal drinking water results, They are under drinking water, public drinking water supplies, and all of that. So if you go to statewide sampling initiative, there are all the test results from the first phase, the second phase, and then if it dropped into a compliance monitoring, then that's also on that page. So ton of information, trying to be as transparent as possible, but there's a lot of information here. So I think we can leave it at that, Christia. Thanks.
Okay, we have a new question that's come in. Does anyone on your program, MPART, know if anyone, does anyone know if anyone has died or been disabled due to, I'm assuming this is PFAS toxicity?
I know that we anecdotally have heard about some people, some relatives of people who have been, impacted by PFAS contaminated groundwater. I don't know that we have scientifically been able to determine that as a cause of death, but I think there's enough toxicity information out there to understand that there's some risks to human health, and that's why we're trying to do everything we can to make sure it stays out of people's drinking water and make sure that we kind of cut out that route of exposure as quickly as we can. And we've got some sites in the state that have had some fairly high concentrations, and so that's why we're here tonight to talk to you guys.
Hey, this is Bill. I would add too that DHHS is doing an exposure health study in two specific areas of the state, the North Kent County and Parchment area. And these health studies, again, it's to try and understand, to get more information, to understand what the health effects are associated with exposure to PFAS, but also to see if we can correlate certain health effects with exposure levels in that. But, and the thing about these studies is that they benefit everybody, not just the people that participate, but everybody else, because it provides us with additional information to help understand the risks from exposure to PFAS.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. I should have brought that up myself. The other thing is there's several other studies. DHHS has actually got 4 or 5 different studies, one on the national level that we're participating in, as well as several on the state level. But one of the really interesting ones is looking at the doing a PFAS survey of firefighters to understand the occurrence of exposure to firefighters who have used firefighting foam over the years. And so that is starting this month. I think they've already had several stations that have actually participated. So that's very exciting and good for everyone to get that kind of data.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Bill. We have no new questions that have come in. So Abby or Christian or anyone else on the team, do you have any final thoughts? Since Christian already took my plug for the Eagle YouTube, so.
I'm sorry about that, Les. Didn't
No
mean to
worries.
take that from you. One thing I wanted to mention that I didn't describe as well as I wanted to is that we're looking at fluctuations. We've had a lot of questions about that in the RAB. We're looking at fluctuations both in our quarterly groundwater data, in our surface water, and we're looking at it in some of our pore water studies as well, our spring waters. And then DHHS is looking at the other aspect of what fluctuations are we seeing in residential sampling. So we are looking at lots of variations, and we have one of the best data sets in the country as far as looking at how that plume is changing over time. And it really isn't changing much over time is what we're finding.
Well, okay. Abby,
Well,
did you have?
good. Yep.
You're good? Okay.
I just want to, I really appreciate everybody coming tonight and showing up to get this important information. I want to give a good shout out to this team who has done tremendous work over the last couple of years to bring you this, quality of information and to be able to provide you with, these residential drinking water samples as well as the on-site and off-site stuff. Has truly been a good example of the MPART cooperation and collaboration. So, but as we said before, stay involved, get involved, keep track of what's going on, and just appreciate everybody's time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.